"You truly look radiant, Cordelia," I said, my voice soft and even. I kept my hands clasped loosely behind my back, my nails digging into my own palms, but my face was a mask of placid acceptance. "The emerald green suits you perfectly." My stepsister, Cordelia, preened in front of the full-length mirror. The gown was a masterpiece of silk and lace, studded with tiny, glittering emeralds that caught the candlelight and scattered it like stars. It had cost more than I would earn in 10 lifetimes of servitude. "Of course it does," she snapped, not even bothering to look at me. She turned her head, admiring the line of her own jaw. "It was made for a future princess, after all. Not for a well, not for you." My stepmother, Lady Amara, glided over and adjusted a fold in the skirt. Her thin fingers, heavy with rings stolen from my own mother's jewelry box, were possessive and proud. "Hush, my darling," she cooed, though her eyes, when they flicked to me, were as hard and cold as the jewels. "Elara knows her place, don't you, dear? Someone has to stay behind and ensure the fires are banked." "Yes, stepmother," I murmured, dropping my gaze to the floor. My father, Lord Valerius, stood by the doorway, sipping his wine. He hadn't looked at me once. Not truly. He saw me as a piece of furniture, a drab and disappointing fixture of his grand house. "Amara, Cordelia, the carriage is waiting," he said, his voice impatient. "We mustn't be late. The prince does not wait." "Oh, father, imagine!" Cordelia squealed, finally turning from the mirror. She rushed to him, a vision in green, and he actually smiled, patting her cheek. "Tonight, I might finally be chosen. I'll be the princess." "It is your destiny, my sweet," Amara said, her voice thick with triumph. "I hope you have a wonderful night," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. Cordelia laughed, a high tinkling sound that always set my teeth on edge. "Don't wait up, Alara. We'll be at the palace. And you won't." They swept out of the room in a cloud of expensive rose perfume, my mother's perfume stolen from my room, and a rustle of silk. I listened to their laughter fade down the hall, the heavy slam of the front door, and the rattle of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones. Only then did I allow myself to smile. I walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain to watch the carriage disappear down the long moonlit drive. They were so happy, so confident. They were heading toward their greatest triumph, the moment they had plotted and planned for, the moment they had bullied and sabotaged me to achieve. And I had let them. In fact, I had helped. I smiled because I knew something they didn't. I knew the royal ball wasn't a search for a bride. It was a hunt. I knew that Prince Theron, the beautiful, melancholic, dark-haired prince they were all desperate to meet, was a monster. I knew his entire family were monsters, creatures of the night who hid their true nature behind a glamour of wealth and royalty. And I knew that tonight, on this very night, Prince Theron was starving. I knew this because in my last life, it was me. I was the one who wore a desperate, patched-up dress. I was the one who caught his eye. I was the one he chose. And I was the one who died, screaming and terrified in a cold, dark, ritual chamber as he drained the life from my body. This time, I was more than happy to let Cordelia have the prize. My rebirth had been a shock, a violent tearing of reality. One moment I was fading, my last breath, a rattling curse on the name Theron. My last sight, the blood on his perfect, cruel mouth. The next, I was gasping, inhaling the dusty air of my own cold attic room, my body whole and trembling. I was 18 again, a full year before the ball. For the first week, I lived in a state of paralyzing terror. I'd wake up screaming, clawing at my throat, convinced I could still feel the phantom fangs. I would lock myself in my room, staring at my own hands, my own solid, living, breathing form. It wasn't a dream. I was back. Once the terror subsided, it was replaced by something else, a cold, calculating rage that settled deep in my bones. I was back, and they were all still here. My family, my memory, now sharp and unburdened by youthful hope, played back the litany of my abuse. It wasn't one single dramatic event. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a daily erosion of my soul. It truly began when my mother died. She was a gentlewoman from a minor noble line, and my father, Lord Valerius, had married her for her small but significant dowry. He was a man consumed by ambition, and her gentle nature was, to him, a weakness. When she died of the fever, his grief lasted only as long as it took to secure his next, more advantageous match. He married Lady Amara within 6 months. She was a widow with a daughter, Cordelia, who was exactly my age. Amara was everything my mother was not: sharp, cruel, socially brilliant, and utterly manipulative. She saw me immediately as a threat to her own daughter's prospects. And so the campaign began. My mother's dowry, which was legally mine, was absorbed into the household accounts for safekeeping. My mother's gowns and jewels were put away and soon reappeared on Amara and Cordelia. I was moved from my bedroom into the attic as Cordelia needed the space for her studies. Cordelia was the golden child. She had tutors for dance, music, and art. I had chores. While she practiced her waltz, I scrubbed the floors. While she learned to paint, I mended the linens. My father, the man who was supposed to protect me, simply watched. He craved status. Amara and Cordelia, with their sharp beauty and social cunning, were his assets. I, with my quiet nature and my resemblance to my weak mother, was his liability. "Don't be so sensitive, Alara," he'd snap whenever I dared to cry. "Cordelia is vibrant. You should learn from her. Stop skulking in the shadows." Remembered one incident with chilling clarity. I had one small portrait of my mother, a miniature I kept by my bed. Cordelia, in a fit of pique after I was praised by a visiting tradesman for my quick mathematics, accidentally tripped and spilled an entire inkwell over it. The tiny painted face was obliterated. I hadn't even screamed. I just stood there, shaking. When Amara arrived, she took one look at the scene: Cordelia's fake tears, my ink-stained hands from trying to save the portrait, and immediately slapped me across the face. "You careless, wicked girl," she hissed. "Destroying such a valuable item. You are just like your mother. Useless." I tried to protest, to explain, but Cordelia was already sobbing into my father's chest. "She was screaming at me, Father. She said I was a wretched replacement. I was just so scared. I tripped." My father didn't even ask for my side. He grabbed my arm and dragged me to the cellar, locking me in for 2 days with nothing but stale bread and water. "You will learn to control your jealousy, Alara," he'd said, his voice cold through the thick wooden door about what. "You will not shame this family." I had learned. Oh, I had learned. I learned that I was worthless. I learned that I was alone. I learned that to survive, I had to be invisible. In my first life, that invisibility was my prison. In this life, I realized it was my greatest weapon. My first life's desperation had been my downfall. When the invitation to the royal ball arrived, addressed to the daughters of Lord Valerius, I had seen it as my only escape. Amara and Cordelia had, of course, locked me in my room, but I had picked the lock, a skill I'd learned from sheer necessity. I'd found my mother's old wedding gown, a simple dress of sapphire blue velvet, and I had snuck out. I had gone to the ball. I had met the prince. He had been so captivating. His eyes were dark and full of a tragic sorrow that called to my own. He ignored all the glittering debutantes, including Cordelia, and danced only with me. He said I was pure and untainted. I thought it was a fairy tale. The engagement was announced the next day. Amara and Cordelia were incandescent with rage. My father was, for the first time, proud. I was swept away to the palace. The fairy tale lasted 3 days. The wedding was not a wedding. It was a ritual. I was taken to a chamber deep beneath the palace, carved from black stone. The entire royal family was there, their glamour stripped away. Their faces were predatory, their eyes glowed a faint, sickly red, and their fangs were descended. Prince Theron, my charming prince, had caressed my face. "Your blood is so sweet, my dear," he'd whispered, his voice no longer melancholic but hungry. "It will sustain us for another generation." My death was an agony I wouldn't wish on anyone. Except, yes, I would. I would wish it on them. On Amara, on Cordelia, on my father. And now I had the chance. My plan began to form the day I woke up. I had a year to stop being a victim and start being a hunter. My foreknowledge was my unfair advantage, and I would wield it like a scalpel won. My first test was simple. I knew from my first life that a freak summer storm would flood the lower town in the third week of July. I accidentally mentioned to the head housekeeper, a woman who had shown me small kindnesses, that the cellar drains looked clogged. "It's just a feeling I have, Mistress Gable," I'd said. I had a terrible dream of water in the pantry. She, believing it an omen, had the drains cleared. When the storm hit, our cellars were the only ones on the street that remained dry. It was a small victory, but it proved my memories were accurate. Now for the real plan. It was beautifully simple. I didn't need to fight for the invitation. I didn't need to sneak out. I needed to do the opposite. I needed to ensure beyond a shadow of a doubt that Cordelia was the one chosen. I had to make her the most appealing, most delicious, most irresistible meal on the menu, too. I remembered Prince Theron's words. He had been drawn to me, he'd said, because I was pure. But I also remembered his eyes lingering on my mother's sapphire dress and the scent of the single white rose I had tucked into my hair. My new strategy had two parts. Part one, the scent. My mother had a small locked box that Amara had never managed to open. I, however, had watched my mother open it 100 times. Inside, beneath faded letters, was a small vial of her rose petal perfume. It was potent, made from a strain of rose that no longer grew in the region. In my first life, I had cherished it. In this one, I saw it as bait. I began to wear a tiny drop on my wrists each day. Cordelia, whose jealousy was as predictable as the sunrise, noticed immediately. "What is that smell?" she demanded one afternoon as I was dusting the parlor. It was my mother's," I said, pulling my sleeve down. "It's wasted on you," she sniffed. "You smell like a servant trying to be a lady." 2 days later, the vial was gone from my room. That evening, the entire house reeked of roses. Cordelia had practically bathed in it. Amara praised her. "What an exquisite scent, my darling, so refined." Cordelia just smirked at me. I kept my head down, hiding my triumph. Part 2. The color. Theron had liked my blue dress. I couldn't risk Cordelia wearing blue. I needed her to stand out, but in a way that I dictated. I spent a month researching in my father's library, a place they never let me go, but which I accessed via a loose panel in the servants' corridor. I found an old, dusty tome of royal history. I carefully, using ink I'd aged with tea, added a few lines to a chapter on the ancient royal line. I wrote that the founding matriarch of Theron's line had revered the emerald, seeing it as a stone of eternal life and vitality. I wrote that in ancient times, brides of the house were always presented in green. Then I forgot the book, leaving it under a chair in the library. It took Amara a week to find it. I heard her gasp from the hallway. That very afternoon, I heard her and my father in his study. "It's a sign, Valerius." Amara's voice was sharp with excitement. "A secret. The prince will be looking for a bride who understands his heritage." "It's probably just superstition," my father grumbled. "Superstition rules the world, you fool," she hissed. "Cordelia will wear green, the finest green. It will set her apart from all the pastel-wearing simpletons." The final piece of the puzzle was me. I had to play the part of the defeated, jealous, desperate victim. This was the only way to make their victory taste sweet, to make them absolutely certain that the ball was the ultimate prize. I began to accidentally let them see me sewing. When Cordelia demanded to know what it was, I clutched the fabric to my chest. "It's nothing, just an old dress of my mother's." It was the sapphire velvet dress. Their cruelty, fueled by my perceived competition, escalated. They gave me more chores. They accidentally spilled soup on the dress, ruining it. They forgot to save me any food from dinner. A week before the ball, I enacted my finale. I went to my father's study, tears streaming down my face. Father, please, I begged, falling to my knees. The invitation says the daughters. I am your daughter, please let me go to the ball just for an hour. I want to see the palace. My father looked at me with open disgust. Elara, do not be pathetic. You have nothing to wear. You have no dowry. You would shame us. Cordelia is our family's future. You are not. Amara, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped in. You selfish girl. After all we've done for you, you try to steal your sister's moment? You would ruin everything with your moping and your jealous face. I sobbed, letting the genuine pain of a lifetime of rejection fuel the tears. I just want one night. No, my father said, his voice final. He turned back to his papers. You will stay here. That is the end of it. I ran from the room, my shoulders shaking with loud theatrical sobs. I heard Cordelia laugh from the top of the stairs. Pathetic, she mimicked my father. I locked myself in my attic room and let the sobs turn into a silent, shaking laugh. They had taken the bait. They had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. They truly believed this was their plan. They were so convinced of their own cleverness, their own superiority. They thought they were sacrificing me for their gain. They had no idea. They were the sacrifice. And now they were gone. I stood at the attic window until the last echo of the carriage wheels faded into the night. The house was blissfully, beautifully silent. I did not bank the fires. I let them die one by one until the house was cold and dark. Then I went to work. This wasn't just about Cordelia's fate. It was about my new life. My revenge wouldn't be complete until I had erased my family from my existence and reclaimed what was mine. I went to my father's study. The lock was simple. Inside, I went straight to the heavy oak desk. I knew from my first life that he kept a false bottom in the third drawer. It contained his private ledgers. I found it easily, and there it was. The record of my mother's dowry. The land, the gold, the investments he had absorbed into his own estate. He had been slowly selling it off to fund Cordelia's wardrobe and Amara's gambling debts. But he wasn't a very good bookkeeper. And he was, I knew, a man who hoarded physical wealth. I went to the portrait of his own stern-faced grandfather on the wall. I tilted it back. The wall safe was behind it. The combination, pathetically, was Cordelia's birthday. Inside was a heavy velvet bag of gold coins and several pouches of jewels. There were also the deeds to my mother's properties, the ones he hadn't yet managed to sell. I recognized a ruby necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. Amar had told me it was lost. I emptied the safe. I took every last coin, every jewel, every deed. I left the ledgers open on the desk, spread for him to see, with the empty safe yawning open. I wanted him to know, in his first moments of panic, exactly who had done this and why. Next, I went to Amara's room. I took back my mother's jewelry box, the one she'd kept on her vanity. It was full of the pieces I'd grown up watching my mother wear. Amara had been doling them out to Cordelia one by one. I took them all. I packed one simple, sturdy bag. I put on my warmest cloak. I didn't take a single thing that wasn't rightfully mine. I walked out the front door, leaving it on open to the cold night air. I didn't look back. I didn't flee the city, not yet. My plan had one final act. I walked through the darkened streets to a respectable inn on the grand square that faced the royal palace. I had saved what little coin I'd earned from selling small bits of mending in the village, and I used it to rent a small, clean room on the top floor. The window looked directly out onto the palace gates. I sat in the chair, wrapped in my cloak, and I watched. I saw the glittering carriages arrive, one after another. I saw the lights of the grand ballroom blazing, a beacon in the night. I could faintly hear the music, the soaring waltzes that I remembered so well. I pictured the scene inside. I pictured Cordelia, her emerald dress shimmering, her face flushed with triumph. She would be drinking the spiced wine, the one that made your head feel light. She would be laughing that high, tinkling laugh. And I pictured Theron. I saw him gliding through the crowd, his dark eyes scanning, scanning, scanning. He would be polite to the other girls, but his gaze would be fixed. He would be searching for his chosen. I knew the moment he would see her. She was, after all, wearing the color of eternal life and smelled of the roses he craved. She would be so easy to spot, so eager. I remembered my own dance with him. He had been so strong, so graceful. He had made me feel like I was the only person in the world. He had whispered, "You are the one I've been waiting for." I knew right now he was whispering those same words to Cordelia, and she, who had been raised on flattery and vanity, would be drinking them in. She would be falling in love just as I had. I waited. The hours ticked by, the music swelled. Then, at the stroke of midnight, just as I remembered, the music stopped. It didn't fade out. It cut off, as if a string had been severed. I leaned forward, my breath fogging the cold glass. The lights in the ballroom didn't go out, but they seemed to dim, to turn a sickly, colder shade. The grand front gates of the palace, which had stood open, swung shut with a heavy, booming clang that echoed across the silent square. On the battlements above, the human guards, with their shining helmets, disappeared. They were replaced as if by magic by tall, thin figures in black armor, their faces hidden by full helms. The Royal Vampire Guard, the true guards. The show was over. The hunt was done. A few minutes later, the side doors of the palace opened. A stream of guests began to pour out. They were dazed, confused. Their faces were slack, their eyes empty. They stumbled to their carriages, whispering about a sudden illness of the king, about the ball being cut short. Vampiric compulsion. They were being sent home, their memories of the last few moments wiped clean, replaced with a plausible story. They would wake up tomorrow with nothing but a faint headache and a sense of anticlimax. I watched, and I waited. One carriage didn't come. The grand crested carriage of House Valeria sat empty by the curb. An hour passed. The square was almost empty. Then the main gates opened just a crack. Two figures were thrown out, physically hurled onto the cobblestones. They weren't guests. They were my family. It was Amara and my father. Amara's hair was undone, streaming down her back. Her expensive gown was torn at the shoulder. My father was on his hands and knees, gasping. They scrambled to their feet, their faces utterly, primally terrified. "No!" Amara shrieked, her voice cracking. She ran back to the gates and hammered on them with her fists. "No, you can't! She's not the one! Take the other one! Take Elara! She's the one you want! Take Elara!" My father just stood there, his body rigid, his mouth open in a silent scream. He was pointing at the palace, his finger trembling. From my high window, I did nothing. I just watched. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I was overcome by a sudden cold impulse. I opened the window. The cold night air rushed in. "Stepmother!" I called out, my voice, clear and strong, cut across the square. Amara froze. She turned, her head whipping around, her eyes searching. My father turned too, his body moving like a rusty hinge. They saw me, high above them, framed in the window of the inn, safe and whole. I raised my hand, and in it, I held the heavy ruby necklace I had taken from the safe. I let it glitter in the moonlight. I smiled. My father's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the cobblestones, a broken, whimpering heap. Amara let out a sound I had never heard from a human being. It was a wail of pure, undiluted hatred, loss, and madness. She stared at me, her face contorting, finally understanding. She had been outwitted. She had been beaten. She had, with her own two hands, thrown her precious daughter to the monsters. "You," she screeched, her voice breaking. "You witch! You monster!" "She got what she wanted, Amara," I called down, my voice light. "She's a princess." I closed the window, shutting out her screams. I drew the curtain. I got into my bed, pulled the warm covers up to my chin, and for the first time in either of my lives, I slept without nightmares. I left the capital before dawn. I sold the ruby necklace in the next town, it alone fetched enough to fund my new life, and booked passage on a ship heading south, to the coast. To the city my mother was from, a place I had only heard stories about. The journey was long, but it was a cleansing. With every league, I felt the filth of my old life sloughing off. I saw the ocean for the first time, a vast expanse of blue and white, and I wept. Not from sadness, but from relief. I was free. I arrived in the port city of Elmira with a new name and a considerable fortune. I used my mother's deeds to claim her small family villa, which had sat empty for years. It was beautiful, overlooking the sea. I used the rest of the gold to buy a small shop in the town's main square. I filled it with books. My sharp mind for numbers, so long suppressed, made the business thrive. I became a respected member of the community. I made friends. I ate good food, I drank good wine, and I read late into the night, the sound of the ocean my only companion. I was happy. I was at peace. Years passed. I almost forgot my old life. But the past has a way of sending echoes. About 5 years after I had fled, I received a letter. It was from Mistress Gable, the old housekeeper. She had found her way to Elmira, having heard of a kind Madame Aline who ran a bookshop. She recognized me instantly, but she was loyal. She had left my father's service soon after I did, as the house had fallen apart. Her letter told me everything. My family's ruin had been swift and total. My father and Amara had been found on the square that morning, raving like lunatics. When my father returned to his study and found the safe empty, the ledgers exposed, and me gone, something in his mind had snapped. He and Amara were utterly destitute. They were hounded by the creditors they could no longer pay, the ones they had intended to settle with the royal dowry. They babbled to anyone who would listen about vampires, about monsters in the palace, about their daughter being taken. They were declared mad, of course. Mistress Gable wrote that they had been committed to a sanatorium. My father, she said, spent his days staring at a wall, scratching tally marks and weeping for his little girl, though no one knew which one he meant. Amara was worse. She sat in a chair in the common room, clutching a single, mud-stained, emerald-green shoe, all that had been left of Cordelia, found by a street sweeper outside the palace gates. She polished it day in and day out, whispering to anyone who came near, it was her turn. It was Alara's turn, the other one. They were supposed to take the other one. And Cordelia, the letter confirmed my deepest hopes. The kingdom was dying. The clear, sunny skies of my youth were now perpetually overcast. A strange blight had fallen on the crops. The people were sick and fearful. The royal family was rarely seen. The new princess, the whispers said, had brought a curse. Her blood, spoiled by a lifetime of envy, cruelty, and spite, had not sustained the vampires. It had poisoned them. Instead of granting them another generation of vitality, it had accelerated their decay. Prince Theron, once so beautiful, was now a rotting, feral creature. His glamour failed. The kingdom was crumbling, eaten from the inside out by the very poison they had so eagerly consumed. Cordelia, they said, hadn't been killed. She had been changed, but her foul nature had twisted the transformation. She was not a glamorous creature of the night. She was a beast, a thing of rage and hunger, kept chained in the deepest dungeons of the palace, a monster even other monsters feared. I finished the letter. I walked to my hearth where a warm fire crackled against the sea breeze. I threw the letter into the flames. I watched the names Valerius, Amara, and Cordelia turn to black ash and float up the chimney. My family had been desperate for a prize. They had lied, cheated, stolen, and abused to get it. I had simply let them win. I had given them exactly what they deserved. I turned back to my window, looking out at the bright, clean sea. I was wealthy, I was safe, I was free. And that was the only justice that ever mattered.